Well, good afternoon. Welcome to what I hope is the first of many workshops, and more importantly, regular workshops and Q&A sessions. If you're watching this, then you've probably found it through the blog or one of the courses. My name's Andrew Shivas. I write the KISS Risk Management blog, and I wrote the Risk Management Basics course. I also wrote a couple of books, one on building a risk management system and the other on how to really understand the risks around your organization. So you probably picked up by now what I focus on is risk management. Because of coronavirus and because of a number of other things, this is probably a little bit more urgent, but in all honesty, I've been meaning to do more workshops and more live stuff for quite a while. So this was the sort of prompt that I needed to get going. Today was going to be more of a kickoff, more of a general session about the workshops and just really an introduction. I'll do that very quickly because there were actually two topics I wanted to cover in a little bit more detail, and I think that they're more relevant and hopefully more useful right now. But just to clarify or just to explain what I'm trying to do with the workshops, I'd like to do these at least once a week. Probably as a Q&A session. There might be a preliminary part, which is a little bit more like a lesson, because what I want to do is roll out a new course and try it live. So what I might do is roll out each part of the course for the first 15-20 minutes and then move on to Q&A. And the other reason for doing Q&A, or the reason for doing Q&A, is that I struggle to keep up with my email. I struggle to keep up with answering questions that I get. And I also realized, and you'll all have come across this, that if you're sitting in a group and somebody has a question, you'll see a number of other people in the group start nodding, and you realize that more than one person has the same question. While I'm still answering them by email, it's essentially one-to-one, and hopefully this way it can be one-to-many. And the final reason for doing group work is I don't have all the answers. It's always good to have a discussion. I learn, and I'll identify things that I haven't thought of. Other people will have other solutions. So I get a lot from it as well. And then hopefully it's a way to sort of spread the wealth of knowledge that the group has. So that's the idea behind the workshops. Today, however, there were two things I really wanted to touch on, and we'll see how those go. The first is just some thoughts about how to make this transition from being, you could say, a peacetime risk manager, overseeing your portfolio, helping the organization understand its risks, and then moving into the response. Now, I understand not every risk manager will actually have a response role, particularly in heavily regulated industries like maybe pharmaceuticals or finance. The risk manager may just be the risk manager overseeing the risk portfolio, and a different group of people will deal with crisis and response. However, for I think most people that have taken the course or reading the blog, like I often have been, you're in a team of one or two, you may be the risk manager, you may also have a response role. And certainly if you work in security risk, security response, very, very much overlap. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, about how to make that transition, how to help your organization make that transition, because it is very different. And then there's a question that someone sent in that I want to talk about. But let me start with how to make this transition from. Here we go. So I just put a few slides together because frankly it helps me keep track of what I'm talking about. So as far as transitioning to the response is concerned, I identified sort of four things to think about, four things to use as a way to get your organization to begin responding. And I think right now, this is really important because with coronavirus particularly, this has been around since arguably November. It's obviously been a bigger issue as the months go on, but it was pretty clear in the early new year that this was a fairly significant thing. We probably, and I say we very broadly, we probably could have started responding a little bit faster, certainly outside of China, we could have. Some countries are being very aggressive and very proactive. Other countries are being a little bit slow. That's also going to be mirrored within organizations. Some organizations will be pretty proactive and moving fast. Others are probably going to take more time. And the problem is that in any kind of a crisis, you don't have a lot of time. Time is definitely against you. So the sooner you can move into the response, the better. You can become a little bit more proactive, even though you're reacting to events. You can become a little bit more proactive. You can start to mitigate the effects much more quickly. And with something like this, it has this a very aggressive growth. Then the faster you act and the earlier you can put interventions in place, the more effect you'll have as far as lessening the effects. So these are the 4 things that I want to really sort of talk about. We're going to start with accepting. So you've got to accept that you're in crisis, and that can seem easier said than done, because we have to go through a number of steps to accept that we're in crisis before we can actually begin to respond, and that can take some time. There are a number of emotions involved in this. This is from the 5 stages of grief, and I need to actually acknowledge the idea of using the sort of grief model I actually picked up from Mike Register when he used to work at Register Larkin, and he used a slightly different model, but it's the same idea. We're going to respond to being in crisis in a very similar way that we respond to grief or to shock. Obviously, the first thing we do is we deny, this can't be happening to me, this isn't real, etc. We might become angry, why is this happening to me? And then we'll start to negotiate and bargain. And for something like coronavirus, that can be with ourselves. We can be negotiating with ourselves and trying to talk ourselves down. Well, it's not really that bad. It's not really going to affect me, etc., etc. There will be a period of depression. There'll be a period of feeling a bit down, understandably, because the enormity of what is happening begins to hit you. And then finally you get to this acceptance point. Until you get to acceptance point, you're not really going to be able to react. You're not going to be able to focus. You've got to get to that stage as quickly as possible, and you've got to help other people get to that stage as quickly as possible. But it's important to note that these emotions don't go away. And the faster you move through them, the more you have to be aware that they are sitting there somewhere and they will have to be dealt with later. You can force people into action and then a degree of acceptance, but you may have skipped over some of the other emotions. So it's important to remember that those are still there, but you have to sort of pass through them, acknowledge them, but try to get to this acceptance point as quickly as possible. If you get stuck in the anger or stuck in the bargaining stage, you're never going to get to the point when you can effectively respond to things. So the first thing is this idea that we have to accept that we're in crisis, and the sooner you can do that, the better. Then the next thing we're going to deal with is moving on to some kind of action. And the best way to do this is to identify and tackle the immediate issues. And often these are quick wins, but this is very, very helpful for moving from this. Actually, it helps overcome the emotions sometimes and accept, because you can get people begin to action things, even small things. Sometimes you can get people moving on it and you start to build up this movement and this momentum. This obviously reduces the impact of these, and it prevents these smaller issues from becoming more significant later. Now, that's not to say that you can kill everything off right now and your job will be done in the early stages. For a real crisis, and certainly for something of this magnitude, that's not going to happen. But you can start to deal with a number of small issues, and that gives you the success that you have. And again, there are some of these small issues. Remember, again, things like coronavirus, we're dealing with this very aggressive growth curve. So the faster we can get in with some kind of intervention, the more effect we'll have. And what this does is you've officially then started to respond. You can say, now we are responding, and you can build on this to generate momentum. And a lot of this is to do with momentum. So the key thing here is that the faster you begin to respond, you can pull people out of the depression that we talked about a second ago, and it helps them to overcome it. So you may still have some people who are struggling to accept what's happening. If the rest of the organization is beginning to respond and they can see that there is a way out of this, that helps them accept, okay, we have a problem, but I can see a clear pathway, and therefore it's easier for them to move forward and begin to be part of the response. The The next thing is about streamlining. So in any organization, even in a family, even in your own life, there's going to be a lot of things that maybe aren't as critical, and you've got to start to do some streamlining right now, because the simple fact is you have a limited amount of resources. And so the faster you can streamline and the more streamlining you can do, the faster you will be as far as response is concerned. So the first thing is what's essential for survival. Is a bit Maslowian, trying to figure out what do we just need to survive. That could be for yourself, your family, your organization. What is the bare minimum you need? So with an organization, it could be cash, for example. With your family, it could be shelter and food. So you've got to think about what's essential for survival and make sure that that's there, and you have to sustain that. But then the next thing is what's essential for your objectives. So if you're an organization, you will have a role to play in society. If you're a government, you'll have a role. You'll have customers if you're an organization, or you may have some social good, some social good you're trying to deliver if you're a charity or an NGO, for example. So you've got to think about what's your objective, but then what is essential to deliver that. And again, if it's not essential, you need to streamline. You need to strip this other stuff away. You can pause and deprioritize those, but it's temporary. Don't kill these things off for good, because at some point we're going to be going back to business as usual. You certainly hope you'll be going back to business as usual. If you are too aggressive right now in the streamlining, for example, if you're a business that starts laying mass layoffs of staff, when it's time to get back to business as usual, you've got two problems. All of the expertise from your organization has gone because you fired them. None of them will want to come back, or few of them will want to come back because you fired them abruptly in the first place. And moreover, their friends and colleagues, and certainly in the professional organizations as well, the other people you're hoping to recruit might not want to come back. So if you're too aggressive at this point with the streamlining, it could have longer term consequences, but you can pause these and then think about what you're going to do as time goes on. But the key thing is to streamline things in the first instance so you can respond more efficiently and more effectively. And the final thing is also streamline your processes, streamline your chain of command, cut away red tape, make sure that everything that you need in order to execute is as straightforward as possible. So you don't need a very complex chain of command. You don't need a really complicated decision-making process. Try and keep it simple. Make sure that you can come up with a plan and execute as efficiently as possible. And again, that's going to help you with the response. You definitely need to streamline that as well. And then the final thing is start to plan. So map out how things could develop realistically. And that's not to have a crystal ball, but it also has, to an extent, means be honest about how things could be. A lot of the modeling around coronavirus has some pretty stark warnings. Now, I'm recording this on the 20th of March. There's still a lot of uncertainty. So if you're watching this later on, then things may have changed. But at this point, there's a lot of uncertainty. But there are some fairly scary, frankly, numbers out there. And we have seen in China, very aggressive spread. In Italy, we've seen very high fatality rates. So you've got to be realistic about what you're dealing with. There's no point hoping that it's going to be the best case scenario, because the best case scenario is gone. That doesn't exist anymore. That's past. We're now in this crisis. We're now in this disaster situation. So you've got to be realistic about how things could develop. Then what you need to do is take the layer on the existing risks for your organization. So what is pertinent and specific to you? Because every organization is different. You have different client groups, you have different stakeholders, you have different cash flow needs, you have different ways of delivering your business. So all of these present different risks. So the threat will come from contagion as far as coronavirus is concerned. What does that threat mean as far as the risks to your organization? That becomes very personal and very subjective to your organization. So map out how things could develop, then layer on the existing risks, and that's going to give you a picture of what things could look like. Then you need to identify triggers and decision points. So what are the triggers, or what are the decision points? What are these forks in the road? So you see that things develop one way, and then there's a trigger. You suddenly notice that it could be positive or negative. So a sudden spike in infections, or a vaccine is developed. That's a trigger and a decision point. You can see that and say, okay, so what does that mean for us, and which one of the sort of paths that you've laid out previously does that take you down? And that's going to give you a sense of where to go. The other important thing is, as you make decisions on the way in, if you're using these triggers and decision points, you need to note those, because it's a little bit like breadcrumbs. So like Hansel and Gretel left the breadcrumbs on the way into the forest, you can then follow them back out. If you've identified and consciously followed these decision points based on triggers, based on conditions you've seen, it's going to be easier to get back to normal, because as those conditions recede, you can then say, because that has now gone, we can reverse that decision, and maybe we go back to limited amount of staffing or limited operations, or turn off some of the measures that you put in place in the, to begin with. And then anything emerging, so the things you see happening now, remember previously we dealt with the immediate issues. Now it's a little bit slightly more longer term or midterm planning. The emerging paths, do detailed planning for that. So as you see, for example, we have, I'm in Jordan right now, and we will have a curfew starting at 7 a.m. tomorrow. It's not entirely unexpected. There's been some talk about it for some time, but it's now official as of first thing tomorrow morning. So we now know that, okay, what plan do we need to put in place specifically for that? Longer term, we may have other pathways that we start to look at. But for now, we know that there are certain things happening, so we can do the detailed planning for those. And then once those are in place, top level contingencies, 3 or 4 bullet points may be sufficient, just to say, if we see this, these are the kind of things we'll do. And you don't need to plan those out in detail right now, but you start to think about those, so that essentially you have this sort of very top level playbook that you can then start to develop as the long-term top level contingencies become emerging paths. So it goes from being a potential thing that may happen to an actual thing that is happening. Then you go into detailed planning, and then you execute. By the time you've gone through all of this, you've definitely moved from being in peacetime mode to response mode. You've got everyone to the point where they accept that you're in crisis. You've then started to action, tackling those immediate issues. And now you've got into the planning stage where you're actually planning ahead, and then you can take those plans and execute. The key thing is to be moving forward. And once you've built up a little bit of that momentum, you can then see you'll fully have made that transition into response mode. And the other thing that's going to help you with that is the streamlining. So you've streamlined the organization, so everything you're doing can be done more efficiently, more effectively. You're still focused on survival. You're still focused on objectives, but you've put these other things on hold to help you move forward and build up some momentum. Just a couple of final thoughts on this. This seems a little bit flippant in a way, but we have this fight or flight response. It's a natural, normal human reaction. You will want to run away from this. We all want to run away from it. We hope it'll go away. We'll go to bed and hope that it's not there the next day. We'll be looking for a way to just opt out. If it's something very bad that affects your organization, or something very bad that affects the whole of society, as we're dealing with now, flight's no longer an option. You have to fight. You have to fight the thing. You have to fight to win. You can't run away from it, unfortunately. And the point of this is you have to make this success happen. There is no passive success. If you sit back and do nothing, whatever the events are will overwhelm you. They will overtake you. It could be coronavirus. It could be a very aggressive, another very aggressive player in your marketplace. If you are passive, if you are not responding, it will just overwhelm you. So you have to make this success happen. You can't just hope that everything will work out. You have to act a little bit faster than you're comfortable with. You're not going to have a perfect plan. Those don't exist. You won't have all of the information. You're going to have to act at a point when you don't feel quite ready. But the faster you're acting, you can always course correct later. The faster you start to act, the more likely you are to build up momentum. And you'll find that most decisions can be tweaked or reversed later on. There are very few things where you make a decision and you've shut the door to adjusting that in the future. And you have to throw everything you have at the situation. I wrote about this about a week ago or within the last week. You have to throw everything that you have. You can't do it piecemeal. You can't put out a fire by throwing cups of water onto the fire. You have to drop buckets or gallons or put a fire hose onto it. So you have to throw everything you have at the situation as early as possible. Again, particularly when you have this exponential or this very aggressive growth, you can't just do it piecemeal. You have to throw a lot in early if you want to have any kind of meaningful effect. And I think this is quite a useful little quote to finish with. This is Dr. Fauci, who's pretty well respected in the US. And I think because of his work through Ebola previously around the world, as several people have had other quotes along these lines, it will look back on what we feel is overreacting right now, and that was either right or it may not even have been enough. So have this in mind. It is going to feel uncomfortable. You will feel like you're maybe moving too fast. Maybe you made a decision to turn off some of your business too early. Maybe you feel that you've dedicated too many resources to the situation. It could well be that that feeling actually is the right one. So that's just a little bit on moving to the response. I hope you find that useful. It may help you personally. If you're struggling to sort of come to terms with what we're dealing with and get from a more peacetime, longer term, what could the risks be, to this mentality of we're dealing with a situation right now. I need to get on top of this. I need to start to manage this, or maybe some things in there to help your organization. I'm probably going to take these ideas and work on them a little bit and turn them around. So I'll at some point in the next couple of weeks write about this in a bit more detail, and I may have fleshed those out a little bit. But I think that, I think those 4 points are really what we need to think about as far as success is concerned. So obviously we have to start by accepting and move to action as quickly as possible. And anything you can do to streamline the organization, anything you can do to dump any excess weight to help you move forward quickly is going to be key. And then you can start to actually plan, see what may be coming, and then continue to move forward, because the response is going to be a long-term thing. And it's important to remember that it's not a day or a week in any crisis. There's very few things are over within a few days, and the effects will go on for months or even years. The effects of what we're dealing with now will definitely go on for years and possibly into several decades. It's a generational type thing. That's not to say we have to be at this heightened level of stress and response at all times, but we will have to be dealing with the consequences. And that's a whole other conversation we can have another time about how you deal with the long-term effects. But for right now, accept, action, streamline, and plan. If you can keep those 4 things in mind, hopefully that will help you get your organization from a peacetime mentality to really grasp what they're dealing with and start to move on to the response. So there's one other thing that I wanted to jump on quickly, and it comes from a question that someone sent me, and I won't go into too much of the specifics for anonymity, but it's probably a thing that we've all had to deal with at some point, whether you're a risk manager or not. It's just, how do I manage everything that gets thrown at me? How do I cope with the portfolio of work that I'm supposed to manage, and specifically in this case, from a risk management perspective? So I put some thoughts together that might help. I haven't had a chance to speak to this individual directly, and so I don't know their specific challenges. But in general, it was, I'm struggling to manage the whole, everything that's thrown at them as far as being a risk manager is concerned. So I wanted to put a couple of thoughts out, and this might help some of the rest of you. Again, particularly now, if you're having to juggle both a risk manager role and a response role, because the risk management part doesn't necessarily go away. So here's a couple of things that might be useful. And again, I just threw them onto a slide because it helps me think. Okay, there we go. All right. So I think the first thing you need to try and work out really, are you really a risk manager? Are you a responder or a jack of all trades? I'm saying this from my experience. We put the risk manager title, or organizations put the risk manager title on people who aren't necessarily the risk manager, or the organization doesn't really know what that means. And actually, to jump to the end, quite often you become the jack of all trades, because obviously the risk manager touches every part of the organization. And so you end up picking up a little bit of oversight here, or maybe a little bit of health and safety there, and some governance, maybe a little bit of training, and you just end up having this sort of slightly mixed portfolio, and it's not nice and clean. And so sometimes the workload can stem from the fact that the role and exactly what the responsibilities of that role are have never been properly defined. Probably the biggest challenge is when you have a job title and head of risk. So if you're HR, the HRO and risk manager, security and risk manager, whatever it might be, the first part of that before the and, the first job already has a full set of responsibilities. And now you've added on all these other responsibilities. And really, normally what happens is the risk management part sort of gets pushed to the side. There's a huge rush of activity, maybe once a quarter, maybe once a year. But it's very hard to balance both of these. So that's the first thing, is really just think about, what is the role? Is it defined? Do people understand? Has there been the opportunity to really discuss that? Sometimes it could be that the role just evolved over time, and eventually you're the risk manager, but nobody actually sat down to think about what that meant. So sometimes the overload can come from just a lack of clarity about what you're doing. The next thing to think about is the risk manager versus the risk owner. And I'll link to this in the notes, but I wrote a piece on governance before, and you've got to be clear to differentiate between the risk manager who's in charge of a program and the risk owner who's in charge of a process or part of the organization. So the risks that arise from finance, the risk owner is the CFO, or whoever's in charge of that. The risk manager's job is going to be to oversee the CFO and every other responsible person, to ensure that they're following the system, that the governance and reporting, etc., are in place. So there is a difference between those two roles. The problem can be that sometimes the risk manager almost becomes the risk owner for all of the risks. And in addition to overseeing the risk register and checking that people are managing their risks, they become actively involved in managing the risks. And usually there's no way that somebody can handle just that sheer volume of work. It's very unlikely as well that the risk manager will have the expertise to manage the risks for each function or each group or each component of the organization. And I find this doing workshops. I'll do a workshop. I had a workshop last year for some startups at a startup incubator about assessing the risks to your startup. And what I was trying to do was give them a methodology, and I used the methodology I've used in the course, a slimmed down version, to help them look at the risks that their startup, that their business faced. And then they would have to go off and figure that out, because they're the subject matter expert. They understand their business, their sector, etc. The problem was, as soon as we went through the theory, the questions were all very specific. How do I manage this particular risk from technical debt, or this particular risk from funding, or this particular risk from lack of expertise, or whatever it is? And those are questions I can't answer because I don't know enough about their business to do that, certainly not in the 5 minutes I had with them individually. So I was then moving into the risk owner part and moving away potentially from being the risk manager. So sometimes this blurring between the two, one is oversight of the program and governance, the other is the owner of the actual risks. That can prove a problem. Just to be clear, the risk manager may also have responsibilities, and they are also a risk owner. But all I'm trying to say here is you don't own every risk. And that's where sometimes the additional work comes from. Urgent versus important. I mean, that's always a challenge. What's urgent is whatever your manager thinks is urgent, or whoever shouts the loudest. That can always blur things. That's more of an organizational thing, but that could be one of the challenges. To get around the urgent versus important, you need prioritization. But if you haven't defined your objectives, it's very hard to prioritize. And this is what I talk about in the Risk Management Basics course. And this is what I talk about in Beyond the Spreadsheet, the book about the about understanding your risks. You need to know what you're trying to achieve, what your objectives are before you do the assessment, before you do the prioritization. Otherwise, you're just guessing. Otherwise, you go back to whatever your boss thinks is the priority, whatever the loudest person around the table shouting thinks is the priority. So you've got to have defined objectives to allow you to prioritize. Otherwise, the priorities will keep changing, and you can never really get on top of them, because every day it's just a new set of challenges and a new set of fires to fight. To an extent tied into this, governance and routine. If you don't have the routine built in, if you don't have governance and oversight, and again, I'll link to this, if you don't have a routine, then it's hard to figure out really what you're doing with the program. So if you're not working towards, say, monthly committee meetings to sort of review the register, ensure that you're making progress on all the risks you've identified where you want to have some kind of treatment. If you don't then have quarterly reporting to take that to the next level to see how that streamlines into the organization, and then at the annual sort of cycle, it can get a little bit mixed up where you are in the process. Should you be reviewing the entire risk assessment, or should you just be checking that people are moving through the treatment plan? Again, if you don't have the governance and routine in place, it kind of muddies everything up. And that could be one of the challenges that you've come across in the past, or you are coming across, that's just making it difficult to get on top of that portfolio of work. And the final thing is you can't be a solo risk manager. By what I mean is, you can't just have someone say, you're now the risk manager, manage our risks, unless there is also a system in place and unless you get the support. Because in order to manage the organization's risks, you need all of the stakeholders and the subject matter experts and the managers and the portfolio owners to buy into it, which means you need the support from your leadership. And then you need a system in order to understand your risks, and then a system to address those risks. If you don't have those things in place, there's no point being a risk manager. It's like asking someone to calculate someone without giving them the tools to calculate it, or go and be a firefighter, but don't give them any tools to do that. Whatever the analogy you want to use, just saying you're the risk manager, a little bit like we said in the first bullet there. If it's not defined what you're trying to do, if you don't have a mandate, if you don't have support, and if you don't have a system, you cannot manage the risk. The best you can maybe do is respond as things come up. But then, again, back to that first point, you're just a responder. You're not actually a risk manager. You're a firefighter. You're just going to sit there waiting for the next thing to blow up, jump in, fix it, get back on the bench, and wait for the next one. And I would guess that if you have that kind of system, you'll almost never be on the bench, because you'll go from crisis to crisis to crisis to crisis, and fire, fire, fire. So trying to do this by yourself, I believe, is impossible. And if you find yourself in this situation where there's no support and no system in place, that could be the root of the problem, where you're just getting overloaded because there's no way to manage it all. You've got no support, you've got no system. You're just constantly dealing with a flow of requirements and challenges that you'll never quite get on top of. So depending upon where you are, depending upon the particular situation you're in, it could be that one of these things is the cause of this individual's challenges, and hopefully we'll be able to follow up later in the week and maybe have a discussion about it. But if you find yourself struggling to really get on top of the portfolio, putting aside what's going on right now, because there's so much uncertainty, there's so much to do that we're all a little stretched. But in general terms, if you're finding it difficult to get on top of the portfolio and just manage your work, could very well be one of these things. And this is in addition to that you're a team of one in a 5,000 person organization. Yes, you probably just don't have the resources. Those are slightly separate things, but some of these things particular to risk management, defining the role, differentiate between the manager and the owner, urgent versus important is always the way, always a challenge, but not having clear objectives, that's always going to make everything more difficult. And then putting in place governance routine, or a lack of governance routine, a lack of system, a lack of support, all these things are going to make it just so much difficult. So I hope that these give you some food for thought if you're trying to tackle this yourself. Okay, so that's all I've got as far as slides. That's all I wanted to cover as far as transitioning over to the response. I'm just looking here. So somebody's just throwing up a question. So give me 1 second. So the question is, well, we're still in the response time in the current situation. How do I think organizations will begin to go back to normal without acting as fast as we currently are? So that's from Lauren. So I appreciate the question, Lauren. I think the difficulty here, and it's going to sound fuzzy, because I'm going to say it depends what we mean by we acting as fast as we currently are. I think in a lot of places we're not acting fast enough. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge. And so we are essentially still a little bit behind. We're still a little bit reactive. In some places, we're very reactive. We're very far behind. And what that means is that getting back to normal will be more difficult, because there's just going to be more damage between today and the time when we get back to normal. So I can't really put a timeline around that. I think that we're going to be dealing with a new normal is the other thing. And I probably should have said that earlier. I can't see a way that we can go back to how things were because of the damage this is going to do. So home for me right now is in the Middle East, but longer term home is in the US. We haven't really felt the effects in the US yet, I don't think. We're looking at an enormous change from historically low unemployment to historically high unemployment in less than a year, in several months. We're looking at a whole swathe of businesses will probably struggle if they don't go under altogether. A lot of the assumptions that we've made about things like healthcare, et cetera, are going to be shaken. And so I think normal, it's going to be the new normal. I think we're going to go back to we're going to have some kind of a new normal, maybe a little bit sooner than we think, in the next 2 to 3 months. So I think for a lot of organizations or a lot of societies, we'll have testing in place. We'll have a way to track who's ill. We can keep the people who are ill away from the people who are not ill. We can keep the highest at-risk groups slightly separate. So that will help us manage things better. And that then allows us to get back to work, to move around, to do those things. And then places will start to open up, businesses will go back, but it won't be businesses as usual or normal. And so people will have to adapt to that. So it could be that in certain areas, businesses have to adapt how they're going to work. I think we're all adapting to work from home a lot more now. Maybe that will become the norm. I was listening to something today where people were questioning just-in-time inventory. Just-in-time inventory was great until we have something like this. And at that point, when global supply chains are challenged, just-in-time inventory falls apart completely. So I think we'll go back to working in a semi-crisis mode, probably in the sort of weeks to months time scale. But I think that getting to the new normal, I don't know. I'm not probably qualified to answer that. I hear people talking about 12 to 18 months to find a cure and be able to vaccinate people. So it could well be that the new normal doesn't really kick in for months and months. Again, I need to caveat all this. I'm obviously not a doctor. I'm not an epidemiologist. I can't speak to some of these things in the detail, but that's just my view. I think that we'll adapt to the current situation in a couple of months, or in the weeks to months time frame, but it's going to be longer term before we get back. And I think the final thing on that, there are places where this hasn't quite hit yet, or we don't know how badly it's hit. And there are places where this is one of a series of challenges. East Africa is being ravaged by locusts right now. So on top of their very fragile situation from a food security standpoint, we then add this into the mix, which is another infectious disease that's challenging to manage. Parts of East Africa are still undergoing some kind of conflict. So it's just adding on another level of complexity. And so I don't even know what their normal looks like, because they're already struggling with the effects of from food insecurity, etc. So their normal could be much further down the line. So that's about 40 minutes. So it's a little bit longer than I meant. I actually meant this to be sort of 5 or 10 minutes to kick off the series, to be honest. But then while I was thinking about it, just with the pace of things moving along, this issue of getting on with the response was kind of front of mind. So I wanted to share some thoughts there, and the question on how to manage the risk manager's load. I wanted to get that out there. And Lauren, thank you so much for your question as well. I'm going to throw this up on the website. It'll be recorded, and then what I'll do later on is hopefully get into a rhythm, as I said, of having maybe 15, 20 minutes of sort of slightly more formal presentation with slides, just because it helps me remember what I'm supposed to be saying, keeps me on track, because otherwise I'll wander off all over the place. 15 minutes or so of slides and sort of slightly more formal instruction to try and get this Risk Manager's Essentials course out. So what the intent of that is, to the Risk Management Basics course is for anyone. That's just, I want to understand risk. And it really is basics. It's meant to be the introduction. But then there's so much more on top of that. What I want to do is take all of the next level stuff and all the essential stuff the stuff I think is essential for risk managers, put that together in a course, deliver it through this means to start with, and then actually put it out as a course. So start with that each session, and then get on to the Q&A, whether it's by email or people in the chat, and then just see how we go. And hopefully that way it's a good way to get information out to people as quickly as possible. It's Friday today. I'm going to try and do the next one on Monday and try and get into a cadence, certainly right now, of a couple a week, but just because it's so busy. So thank you so much for watching, for listening. I really don't enjoy being on video, so I hope it doesn't come across just how painfully uncomfortable I am right now. But I did enjoy the interaction with the questions and things like that. I hope it works for you as far as a way to get information across and answer questions. Please let me know whether you're watching this live or whether you're watching a recording. Put a comment in or shoot a note, because I'd love to know. If this doesn't work, there's no point going on. If it does work, I'll continue. If you want me to go longer, shorter, wear a different shirt, whatever it might be, just let me know, and I'll try to make sure that I meet your needs. So thanks again for being part of this. And like I said, any thoughts or comments, please drop a comment in to the chat below, or just shoot me an email, andrew@andrewshevis.com, and just let me know what you think. Thanks so much.